Five, four, three, two, one.
Good. All right. Okay, hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa. Welcome to the Arms Inquisition, episode 275 on Sunday, the 2nd of April, 2023. I'm Phil.
I'm Matt.
Ben's not here tonight.
No.
He's accident and emergency.
He is, again.
Dealing with a child with a broken arm.
Yes.
Which is all you need on a Sunday.
Yeah.
But never fear. We're glad to be joined tonight by David Greenberg. How you doing, David?
Hey guys, Phil, Matt, it's really great to be here with you guys.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I just mentioned before we started streaming that the subject of natural law and the anarchist movement is a subject we've touched on very briefly, occasionally, once or twice, without going into any depth whatsoever. And I don't think it's something either of us really understand.
No, and I can't even remember it being touched upon in the podcast. So this is all new to me. Yes.
Right. Well, I thought. I was eager to get you on, David, and just to give you an idea, in the UK, I don't think this is on the radar as much as it is in the US. Now, I don't know whether that's a cultural thing with Western Europe and the Scandinavian countries. I think we tend to be more socialist. We have a more socialist milieu with socialized healthcare and schools and all the rest of it. And there isn't the same sort of movement or public consciousness of natural law as there seems to be, the impression that I get, that there is in the States. So, yeah, looking forward to this. I mean, I suppose a good starting point is the actual term itself, natural law. I mean, do you have sort of a sort of simple breakdown of what the term means and the philosophy?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also wanted to mention just before that, don't feel bad if you just have come across this, because I didn't know about this for most of my life either. And there are actually reasons why that is so. I mean, this is considered by those who recognize it, who have studied it, it's considered to be some of the most deeply occulted knowledge on planet Earth. So it's not a surprise if the vast majority of people in any country haven't come across it. Of course, part of my work and part of the work of people who are trying to get the word out is to change that. But we also have to be realistic and understand why things are the way they are, why this is not very well known, and then basically start from there. So maybe a really simple way to think about natural law in terms of common sense, street sense, is I can only rightly do things with your consent. I can only use your property, do things with you if you agree to them. I can't force anything upon you morally and rightly. And if I do, there are going to be consequences. And the consequences aren't just because, hey, I get caught or something. There's actually built into reality, there are spiritual laws that are going to guide outcomes so that we actually learn that very important and very simple lesson. That's what natural law is. It's just, the difference between right and wrong is built into reality. And when we do the wrong thing, then we're going to get consequences.
But don't you see lots of people who seem to be doing the wrong thing all the time and get away with it?
Sure. And what happens is there's kind of this, I think, overly simplistic way of thinking about the way this works, that it's just, if you do something bad, a piano is going to fall on your head. Like if you murder someone, a piano is going to fall on your head immediately, and God's going to strike you down. And that's not the way it works. And I think that's also by design, because we live in this reality together. So really, the consequences we reap and sow are collective. So we kind of all get to benefit from the good outcomes if we follow the rules, and if we don't, we get to all suffer together. Even if certain individuals apparently get away with it. So
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common argument. Yeah.
So John Lennon was wrong. Instant karma isn't going to get you.
No.
There is no instant
Well,
karma.
it might.
It might.
It might. I mean, but I don't think it's really the common case. I think the common case is we all suffer together or we all flourish together.
Yes, I guess. I mean, you mentioned in your bio about having a spiritual awakening, and I guess maybe that's a component of people acting probably how you would describe as immorally, is they don't see a spiritual consequence to their actions.
Yeah, I think what I've come to understand is that when people think, act immorally and just think there's nothing wrong with it, either they're a psychopath and they're completely incapable of having that holistic understanding of the difference between right and wrong, or they've been under mind control and they've just literally been mind controlled to actually think something that they know is not true. And it's very deep within them, that knowing, but it's been covered up by all these layers of nonsense and BS. So, but I think with the exception of people who are born psychopaths, we all have that capability of knowing that it's wrong to take things that don't belong to us. And, we don't really need to make a big deal out of it. But the whole society that we've grown up in, all of us, in whatever country we're in, has largely been built on immorality and coercion. In other words, we get to tell people what to do. Government is allowed to punish people for not following their often arbitrary and ridiculous rules, and they can use any kind of violence, and that's considered actually moral, which is the complete opposite of what's actually true.
So, David, do you think the concept of right and wrong is something that we're born with? Because I don't know what sort of psychological thoughts would be on this, like from a sort of psychological perspective, whether it's nature versus nurture, whether it's something that's taught. I mean, I remember hearing as a kid that your parents had to teach you the difference between right and wrong. But are we saying that no, there's some sort of natural inherent morality that we all understand without having to be taught?
Yeah, well, thinking about myself when I was a kid, I do remember even when I was doing things that now I know were wrong, I remember always having a feeling like, deep down inside, this is not right. I think the answer is it's both. There's an inherent component. In other words, there's an innate common sense and intuition. And then there is a reinforced component that is done through education. So part of the role of parents actually is, one of the main roles of parents is to reinforce that inner knowing. So it's not to impart upon the child this knowing because the child already has that naturally. Again, they're a psychopath and they're incapable of experiencing the emotions related to morality. But for 99% of the people, the parent's role would really be to reinforce that through lessons, through teachings, through feedback, through some kind of parental guidance, to just keep reinforcing that natural knowing so that it flourishes, so that it just becomes, holistic. So it becomes both that inner knowing, but also just the practiced way of that child growing up in the world. So it's, like a lot of things, it's not just one or the other. It's a blend of both of them.
And right. And what about when you do things wrong? Because we all make mistakes and we all do things that we regret the next day, or we say something we regret, or act out at our kids when our kids are winding us up, something like that. How does that fit in with like this sort of concept? Because there's often a temptation, if you're a fairly introspective person, to kind of beat yourself up over mistakes that you make when you sort of analyze. If you're the type of person who analyzes your own behavior, to sort of bludgeon yourself with your own misdeeds and your own wrongdoings from maybe 20 years ago even.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. People can be very hard on themselves. I know I have been. It's important to, on the one hand, recognize that we can't change the past, so we have to accept if we did something or if something has happened, we have to accept the truth that is the truth. But I think the mark of really being able to grow is to learn from our mistakes, no matter what they are. So whatever wrong we committed, if we can just look at it and say, yes, I was wrong. three very powerful words. I was wrong. I did the wrong thing. I now know that. I recognize that. Moving forward, I'm going to make my best effort to not do that ever again in my life. I'm going to make an effort to be an even better person, and just take that in stride. Take that as a lesson. I think if we can take that more higher ground view, and we can kind of, we might not be able to completely get out of feeling bad about it. Again, that might be natural because we need to feel something, and there needs to be a consequence. But so that we don't just wallow in depression, if we can just learn the lesson, grow from that, and keep moving forward, then I think that is the best outcome that anybody can make of any wrongdoing.
One of my favorite sayings is, a fool learns from his mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others. Sort of prevent you doing these sort of things. And while we're talking about mistakes, from the perspective of natural law, is there a compulsion to sort of make amends? If you're a follower of the philosophy of natural law and you do make a mistake, is there, something pushing to sort of try and right that wrong or pay something else forward in another way?
Yes, I think so. First and foremost, it would be with yourself, because you can only, one of the things we recognize as students of natural law is we can only control ourselves. We only have the right to control ourselves, our own mind, our own actions. So get right with yourself first. That's the most important thing. We can't force forgiveness on anyone else. That would not be true forgiveness. But we can certainly go and do what is prudent, what is called for to try to rectify it. If we've harmed someone else and there's a chance to offer to do something to compensate, then we should at least make the offer, recognize that it may or may not be received, and we can't control that. But if we can at least make the offer, even if it's a little bit difficult to do that, then that's going to go a long way. And chances are, if it's made out of sincerity, in many cases, it will be accepted. And that can, while it can't change the past again, it can at least bring back balance. That's what justice is, bringing back that balance. So by, compensating in some way, even if it's something very small, even if it's just, apologizing and saying to the other person, I know I was wrong because I did this, because I know it's wrong. Here's why. I recognize this and I commit to never doing that again. Even if they're not going to offer something in return, that may be enough in some cases when done sincerely. And that's already much more powerful, something that unfortunately not a lot of people are doing.
No, it's very difficult to say sorry, isn't it? I mean, we all have personal lives, families, and wives, and it's easy to make mistakes and say the wrong thing. And it's something you said earlier, admitting when you're wrong as well. That's something we really have trouble with, because we get so wrapped up in our own beliefs and our own ideas. And it goes back to that. It's what is it? Easier to convince someone they've been fooled. It's easier to fool someone than convince them they've been fooled. Yeah, how many old wives quotations? I don't know. I'm just going from one to the next.
If you fool me once.
Yeah, that's George W., isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Now watch this drive.
Yeah. I think there is something, though, about saying sorry. That's something that my wife says that I'm terrible at doing. But I think that's just because I'm right all the time. But yeah, you're right. So I don't know. I think there is something about growing as part of admitting that you're wrong. Certainly within sort of any time, I guess, but certainly within your personal relationships and your close relationships. So if you admit that you're wrong when you've done something wrong, would you say that then that kind of readdresses this spiritual balance?
Yes, I would say that's already half of the battle, because
okay.
half of the battle, is admitting that you're wrong. I, just again, to make it personal in terms of my own life, as I was going through this experience of learning natural law and just being exposed to a higher level of consciousness, if you want to call it that. I, of course, went through my own dark night of the soul. I went through my own period of recognizing all the shitty things that I had done in my own life, all the ways that I had acted, and still remembering, still unfolding that. And it can be very hard. And I think part of it is the ego, the part of us, and I can see, looking back at my behavior in the past, I can see how this played out. But my ego, or the ego of anyone, is hates to be wrong. The ego hates absolutes, hates judgment, it will do whatever it can to protect and defend the individual, and it's probably by design that way. But we are not just our ego. Our ego is just a part of us. So it's okay for the ego to be protective of us, but we can't let the ego. It's not appropriate to let the ego run the show. So there is a point where the higher self, or the higher level, the higher consciousness of an individual is going to step in and say, okay, ego, I know you want to run the show here, but we've got to admit, what we've done. We've got to take responsibility, because that's the part of that I think we have. That's the precursor even to admitting I was wrong, is to take full responsibility in the first place. And we're not there yet. And this is another aspect of natural law that people struggle with, or objective morality, is the first principle, even before not causing harm, which is you are sovereign, meaning you are responsible for yourself. Everything that happens to you in your life, everything you do, the consequences of all your actions, you can't delegate that responsibility to anyone else. You are inherently responsible for everything that you do, even if you didn't have all the information. So you just need to do the best that you can, which means you continually, we need to continually educate ourselves, and we need to go through a process of self-introspection. I don't think it needs to be beating ourselves daily, every moment of the day. I don't believe in extremes. I don't believe that we should be suffering all the time, but there needs to be some kind of supervision, and some, even if we have to practice it. And I think if young children were taught if we're kind of nurtured in a way that we can't admit we're wrong, in a way that allows us to overcome that and see the good that goes beyond that admission, then we'd probably become more practiced than that, and it wouldn't be so much of a struggle as we go to adulthood.
You mentioned about having a spiritual awakening, and this is something that interests me because we do live in a very materialistic society, a very utilitarian sort of outlook in the way we organize our lives, and religion or spirituality, however you would describe it, has been on the decline probably since the Enlightenment, really. And so I'm very interested in because what triggers this change in people sometimes in later life. Could you tell us a bit about what sort of triggered your spiritual awakening?
Yeah, I think it really boiled down to reaping the consequences of the actions that I was sowing, and having that catch up to me to one degree or another. So again, going back to that analogy that karma is not like a piano falling on your head, but yes, something is going to happen in your life in the long view. And I would say, going back to even these characters who seem to be able to get away with a lot, there will be ultimately a price to pay, whether it happens later in their life or even after their life or another lifetime. We're not to say that. But for me personally, what I saw is the consequences of my choices started to catch up to me. They started to catch up to me in terms of my health. They started to catch up to me in terms of my finances. They started to catch up to me in terms of my mental acuity, my well-being, and just almost every dimension. My relationships with friends, romantic, family relationship with myself. So as more and more consequences, we can call them negative consequences or suffering, if you want to keep it simple. So as I started to suffer more and more, this pressure of suffering, I think, was only going to lead me to one of two places. It was either going to lead me to oblivion, where literally I was just going to get crushed under the weight of all the suffering, or it was going to lead me to raise up my hands and say, stop, I get it. I don't want to suffer anymore. I'm going to, I need to take a look. I'm going to do what it takes to understand why I'm suffering. I'm going to take a step back here and try to understand things. And of course, reality always gives clues that there's more going on here than just the material world. Like, we get clues all the time through synchronicities and other things, but we may or may not notice them depending on where we are in life. And I think I did a good job of noticing them. I also took a few psychedelic or entheogenic drugs over a certain period of time, mostly about 10 years ago. And I think that also helped accelerate my awakening, as well as being exposed to certain messages, certain art, films and art that had a message, or things that happened in my own life. So I don't think it's ever just one thing, but I would say that suffering, if there was one thing that made the biggest difference for me, and maybe perhaps for many people, it will be the suffering that they bring upon themselves through the consequences, the long view consequences of their actions.
It's amazing how suffering, as we're putting it, can often is the catalyst for some sort of awakening like this. And yeah, it just makes you think. I'm trying to think of people who haven't suffered and then had like a born again moment, or. But I found it interesting. You sort of said there was either two directions. It's either nihilism, or it's a spiritual awakening. It's such a cliff edge, that, isn't it? Psychologically, to be in that position where you've got two choices, it's oblivion or a spiritual awakening. It's such a stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And there may be, again, I don't remember specifically, but what seems to happen is after we live our life, and maybe in between lives, we have a different view of things, and things that we may be crushed into oblivion, spiritually in a lifetime, but we may still have a chance to learn that lesson. I think ultimately, the soul, the part of us that lives beyond this life, is not going to be crushed, but it can be seriously degraded based on our experiences in life. And so we're either going to get it or not. There are lessons to be learned. And sometimes they're very basic lessons, like just respecting other people, respecting, the individual versus the external, that, the I versus the other. And then, of course, not causing harm, respecting free will, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of lessons that one can learn as a soul incarnated in this lifetime or in any lifetime. But I think in a given lifetime, if someone can really go down a dark path, their soul can really be crushed just by continually choosing, maybe even consciously choosing that dark path. And they'll just go down and, down that path. And, I'm not sure what happens after that, but I think the vast majority of people with enough suffering would probably cry uncle, meaning they would say, okay, I get it. It's time for me to take another look at this. So, that's what the word respect means. It's look again. So I'm going to take another look. I'm going to respect myself. I'm going to try to figure this out. I'm open to, considering something that I haven't considered until now.
You mentioned shadow work a little bit earlier, and someone was talking about it in the chat just before. This is a new concept to me as well. But is this based on Carl Jung's interpretation? Your understanding of shadow working?
I think I have somewhat of a holistic view that does draw upon that as well. My understanding of shadow work, and I can explain it as I've done it, is really you're actually sitting down with yourself consciously and intentionally, and you're taking a good hard look at yourself and your behaviors, specifically your behaviors. But then, of course, the precursor is looking at your thoughts and feelings that led to those behaviors, or your responses to those thoughts and feelings that led to those behaviors, and what your motivations were. And you're not letting yourself off the hook. In other words, if you have done bad things objectively, you have behaved in an objectively wrong way, as per what we're talking about, then you don't let yourself off the hook. You try to understand. You keep asking better questions. Why did I do that? Why did I behave that? What motivated me to do that? Why do I continue behaving? Why do I always lash out at people under certain circumstances? And so on and so forth. Why do I throw away my romantic partner after 6 months, discard them like an old rag? Just to use an example. So we don't let ourselves off the hook. We actually try to get in there and figure out. We don't run away from it, and we call it shadow work because it is the shadow self. It is the darker aspect of ourself. It is the deep recesses of our psyche, the things that we normally would want to. Most people would probably want to keep it. They would be afraid to face that part of themselves. The part that there's even a part of us that can. We all have the capacity to do things that we haven't even done. Like we all have the capacity to murder someone, even if we don't always act on it. So, shadow work is about not being afraid to face that aspect of ourselves that is capable even of doing even darker things that we've done, and really working on that part and integrating, trying to come up with a way not to try to eliminate it, because that would be a misunderstanding of this work, because the light and the darkness, the duality, this is the way things are in this reality. There's a duality. So we're always going to have the light and the darkness. And the darkness is the contrast. So, without darkness, we can't distinguish the light. So shadow work is not about trying to annihilate aspects of your psyche or your consciousness or your of your psyche, of your psyche or consciousness. It's about recognizing them and integrating them and transmuting them into something else so that your outwardly manifesting behaviors will change accordingly, right? You might still be an edgy person. You might still be, you're not going to suddenly become love and light. That's not the goal either. I think you go to one extreme, but you're going to have everything more in balance. You're going to be much more of a balanced being because you're really taking a good look at yourself and, designing yourself consciously.
Yeah, the subconscious. I'm just thinking about this book. That book you lent me, the Carl Jung one, the archetypes.
It is, yeah.
And there's a lot of talk about the subconscious. Well, it's all about the subconscious, and it makes you wonder how sort of malleable it is, through conscious work. If you can really affect your subconscious in a meaningful way, do you think that's actually possible?
Yes, yeah, it is. That's why we see people can be hypnotized and are hypnotized. That's, a lot of the mainstream society is built on hypnotism through television and other means. So, I'm actually going to be doing a presentation coming up called Understanding Human Nature. And one of the 5 aspects of human nature that I'm going to talk about is going to be the fact that we are very programmable. So, and I think that programmability comes through the relationship between our conscious and subconscious. So the conscious mind is kind of like the guard or the gatekeeper, the aware one, the one who's keeping an eye on everything. But there is a deeper level to our consciousness that can be implemented, that understands through symbolism and can be programmed. And if there isn't a conscious oversight, or if the conscious part of us allows something through, just says, here, go ahead, we're going to accept that, or it doesn't create a filter, then yes, we could be programmed in any number of ways. We can be programmed really to have to act or to believe in almost any way that one can imagine. So it is that consciousness that we bring, as kind of the oversight or the sovereign. That's where the self-sovereignty comes in, because the sovereign aspect of our consciousness is the one who's keeping an eye on everything and making conscious choices about what we want to allow into our program, into our subconscious.
Yeah, and then deprogramming what you've sort of taught your subconscious already. That's what I'm finding intriguing about the Carl Jung book, because he suggests that a lot of the archetypes are inherent.
Well, that's his,
in your subconscious.
Yeah, that's his idea. Is that essentially it's there, isn't it, in your biology and in your makeup, essentially. But I suppose the unconscious is you kind of think of it as a little bit of a mystery. But there is something called, a simple way of, or a more simple way of thinking about it is sort of like a difference between explicit and implicit memory. So like an implicit, I'm probably going to get this the wrong way around, memory. So for example, when you're learning to drive, it's quite explicit to begin with. It's very effortful, so you have to sort of think about when you're changing the gears and all the rest of it. And then you stall and everything's like, you're overwhelmed basically. But now that you can just drive, essentially, and that because the actual learning has gone into your mind and has become it's unconscious behavior.
Becomes like a program.
Yeah, essentially, and it runs in the background. So you're not consciously aware. But the thing is if a child steps out in front of you, your conscious mind takes over again.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure we've all had that experience where you've driven somewhere and stopped the car and thought, what? How did I even get here? You remember nothing from the journey because you're almost like on autopilot.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Your brain's that clever.
But that's just a really simple example of how people, could perhaps relate to the unconscious. But if that, that's just one example, but you will have an unconscious template for how you manage relationships, like you were talking before, ending a relationship after 6 months, there's probably something in the background running about that you're not even thinking about necessarily until you start to focus on it, maybe, and ask those questions.
Right. So, David, do you think we have, as a mass society, we have subconscious programs running that sort of dictate a lot of our automatic behaviors, the way we sort of react, the way we operate in the world, the way we treat other people, our working environments. Do you think the subconscious is having a huge effect on the way the majority of us out there operate?
Definitively, yes. I can't say exactly what percentage it is, but people like Dr. Joe Dispenza and others who have spoken about this and done research, some of them claim that it could be upwards of 80 or 90% or more of our daily thoughts are automatic or semi-automatic. And I think, again, we think about social engineering and the way society has been created, these occultists, these ancient psychologists who understand how this all works, they are actually weaponizing this against them. So they know that because, let's say, 80% of our behaviors are automatic and learned, they know that they can program all this junk ways of behaving into us, and ways that will over time, after many years of programming, just become who we are. They become an aspect of us. Then they've got us. They can get us pretty much to act and behave any way they want. They can get us to literally destroy each other, and potentially even destroy ourselves as a species, through our actions. So yeah, we're as you start to dive into this more, you pay more attention not only to yourself but also the way other people talk in conversations. And I can tell you, when I'm having conversations with most people, the number of automated programs that I hear coming up about such and such a concept, especially with respect to authority, government and authority, this is the number one thing that I notice in people because I pay a lot of attention to this. It's kind of my focus within the natural law realm, this notion that people do not have a right to rule over other people. And so I notice people say these things almost automatically. It probably is automatic. It becomes second nature for them. And that's because they've been conditioned to think a certain way. And that conditioning literally informs even what you would think would be their conscious conversation. When having a conversation, you would think having a conversation with someone that they're actually consciously choosing their thoughts, carefully choosing and curating their ideas as they share them with you in that conversation. You would think that, but I think, unfortunately, from my experience, that is not the case in the vast majority of cases. People are actually running on autopilot, like that great analogy of driving the car, which is a really great analogy, very relatable, because almost everybody's learned how to drive. So I think that's a great analogy of what happens. And then when the child pulls in front of the road, that's when that suffering and that crisis happens as a consequence of our choices that finally catches up to us. That's that oh shit moment where we do have to actually face the consequences of these learned behaviors or these learned thinking patterns that turn into behaviors. And now we can no longer run away from that. And that's where the shit hits the fan, I guess you could say. And it just doesn't happen necessarily every minute. Even if we're driving badly, we could probably get away with driving badly for a while before we're going to finally hit something.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned about authority and people's either reluctance, reticence, or whatever. They're sort of unable to question the role that the state should play. And are you sort of the view that governments should be abolished, that we don't need them?
Well, yes, that would be ideal. It's not just my personal view, I should mention. Again, it's objectively true that no one has a right to actually rule over anyone else and enforce that rule through violence. That's just very, very simple truth. However, many people in the world, and most people, myself included, have either thought that or continue to think that. Again, we could talk about that at length. As far as how it all play out, abolishing government versus, how would we get out? How do we extricate ourselves out of the situation? I'm not someone who has a very simplistic way of looking at things that I propose to know how it's going to play out. All I'm suggesting at this point is that we need to recognize the truth and start to act accordingly in our individual lives and start to implement that. Whether that means governments will all disappear within 6 months or a year, I can't answer what's going to actually happen as a result of that. I'm not saying we should protest them either. All I'm saying is that, the first thing is to internally know that it's objectively true that you don't have a right to rule over me. I don't have a right to rule over you. The only kind of interactions that we can have with each other is what we voluntarily agree to, which could be nothing, could be be just leaving each other in peace. It could be, for example, like we're doing today, where we agree to have a conversation, or it could be some kind of trade, some kind of interaction, some kind of work together. Those are all moral and right, and we can solve any problems as a society, including the ones that, for example, people who have a socialist view, for example, if you want to take that, who believe in more equity. I mean, there is a voluntary way to implement that kind of society that doesn't involve violence and coercion. It wouldn't be called necessarily socialism, but it would maybe look more like that than what we have now. So I don't propose to know how this is all going to play out. All I know is that my role is to speak to you and each individual I come across and remind them of the truth that you don't have a right to rule over me. I don't have a right to rule over you. And that person over there claiming to be an authority doesn't have a right to do what they're doing. The only reason they're able to get away with it is because you and I, sometimes in my life, and others continue to believe in their illusion of authority, continue to believe that they actually have a right to do that. And we are basically giving our sovereignty away, or we're attempting to give it away.
Yeah,
to that person, or to that entity.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with the logic. That simple phrase that someone else doesn't have the right to rule over me or you or anyone else. I mean, it's kind of bulletproof. I mean, would someone on the other side of the argument say, well, the government, it rules us with our consent because we participate in a system where we have these elections and we vote for people to represent us, so that it's not a sort of a dictatorship in that way. They're ruling on our behalf with our consent. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, my response to that would be some people, maybe even most people, may consent. And you are correct, actually. The authority does require our consent. And the reason it does is because we have free will.
Yeah.
And one of the other aspects of human nature is we all have free will. So even when we think we're not making the choice, we are making the choice. So authority knows that, authority knows that it needs our consent. So that's why it creates all these machinations and all this complexity to get us to agree. But it's important to understand that even if let's say we lived in a world where there were 100 people, and even if 99 of the people agreed to go along with, let's say 98 of the people agreed that one person was the ruler and could do whatever they wanted, and one person didn't agree. It's not a case of majority rules. That's not what determines the morality. That one person is actually correct. They're correct. No one has a right to rule over anyone else. It's just the other 99 are going along with the illusion, right? So that's why we have these conversations, because really the only way to change is I can't force you to think anything. I'm not trying to get anybody to believe me. That's the point. I'm not trying to force an ideology down anyone's throat. I'm simply going to speak the truth, knowing that it's the truth, to remind you, right? What you do after that is entirely up to you. But I also know the way it works. And I know that when more people start to withdraw their support for something that is an illusion and just a mental construct and doesn't actually exist naturally and isn't beneficial, it isn't good, I know intuitively, and even from my own microcosmic experience in my own life, I know that when people start to take back their authority, then only good things can happen. So that's why I do this. That's one of the reasons why I do it. And the other is, a lot of times people use the claim of necessity of like the lesser of two evils argument, or the necessity of authority because, people need, somebody needs to build the roads, or somebody needs to fill out punishment. My response to that is very simple. If the ends never justify the means, we've seen this in history many times, that people claim that the ends justify the means. So we need to throw that away because that'll never be right. However, if we can agree that the end goal is noble, if we can agree that the end goal is right, let's use something very benign like paving the roads, right? This comes up a lot. Let's agree that paving the roads it's relatively neutral. It's not necessary, but it can be beneficial. It's neither good nor evil. So we can agree that generally it can be beneficial. So if that's the end goal, and if that's a worthy goal, because people can then transport themselves better, then there is a voluntary, moral way to solve that problem. It can be done through 100% voluntarism. It can be done without any violence or coercion. It can be done through people voluntarily offering up their assistance, knowing that in doing so, they will receive, they know they'll get a benefit from it. They know it's the right thing to do. They don't need to be told what to do. They may have a certain skill set. We live in a world with many billions of people, there's always going to be enough people to solve any given problem, in terms of technology or designing, what we can call societal design. So my answer is very simple. It's a fallacy argument. It's a wrong argument to claim that we need government or authority to solve these problems, because we can solve them ourselves, right, through voluntarism.
And they'll be solved through necessity as well, because I remember a story years ago, I want to say maybe 10 years ago, there was some country village somewhere out in the sticks, and they couldn't get broadband internet connection, and the state wasn't willing to do it. It was going to be too expensive, I guess. There was so few houses in this village that the network operator wouldn't provide, wasn't willing to spend the cost of the infrastructure to service a small group of houses, say. I'm kind of making this up. But so they did it themselves. They got together, the community got together, and they started laying the cables themselves and digging the trenches and filling them back in. Because they had to.
Great.
They're like, the necessity is the mother of invention. I'll keep dropping them in.
Oh, you're on fire tonight.
yeah. I mean, I suppose that's sort of one of the question marks in my head when it comes to this sort of new way of organizing ourselves is how scalable it is. Will it necessitate a completely different landscape, a redrawing of boundaries, doing away with national boundaries, that sort of thing? Do you think it's, would the world be unrecognizable in those sort of terms, do you think? If it was implemented at scale. Can it be implemented at scale? It's the first question.
Yeah, this is a really great question, and it is somewhat we can't really know the answer until it plays out. I can make an educated guess that I think, yes, in the long view, society will evolve in ways that will become almost almost unrecognizable, or very difficult to even imagine from our current perspective the further in the future we go. Assuming that we go down this path of embracing true principles, then things will start to change radically. As far as scale, I mean, we have to just accept the fact that we've gotten ourselves in this current situation through our own consent, that we talked about, through going along with certain belief systems that are inherently wrong, but we've gone along with them for convenience or for whatever reason. So we've gotten ourselves in the mess. It's like you find yourself in the swamp. You're going to have to get out of the swamp. So humanity is going to have to get out of the swamp that we've essentially co-created for ourselves. So it's probably going to be painful. It's almost certainly going to be painful, even to a degree that we can't necessarily fully comprehend as we transition, as we start to evolve. It doesn't necessarily mean that the whole world's going to burn down, or it has to be Armageddon or mass suffering on that level. Although I guess that is one scenario. But it could also just be a painful time, but also a time of hope, where we start to implement things, one by one, and we figure out how to solve problems at scale. I think the key is that as human beings, we have this amazing ability to tap into the infinite, because we are an aspect of creation itself. We are an aspect of the infinite. We have people have called it infinite intelligence, the higher self, the higher will, the will of God, intuition, imagination. People have often thought of imagination as being able to tap into a much greater field of knowledge and vision that we as individuals have. So if we can start to tap into that, maybe we'll come up with solutions that will make paving roads seem like old, like ancient stuff, like archaic and ridiculous. And we will evolve technologies that will be so far beyond what we can even imagine that, yes, and maybe that may include, I'm just speculating, of course, human beings being able to populate other worlds other than just planet Earth, as it were, or any other number of scenarios. So it's really hard to know, but ultimately, when you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, then creation starts to present you with solutions that you may not have even thought of.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to ask, something just came into my mind, about the difference between perhaps, this kind of natural law system and the system that we live in now. And you mentioned psychopaths just before. And I suppose, what was coming into my mind was whether it would be easier to take advantage of the society as it is now, with its structures, and sort of ladder to kind of where you want to go if you have that kind of mindset. Or would it be more difficult to take advantage of a natural law society, because it would be seen more easily. So, you know, if you think of like the bell curve, you know, distribution curve, and psychopaths would occupy, you know, one end of that, so the thin wedge essentially. So I just wonder, you know, whether the system now or a natural law system would be better or worse for those kinds of people, I guess.
Well, I'm not sure. I think, you know, to get into the mind of a true psychopath who completely lacks, you know, someone who is born a psychopath lacks the ability to feel emotions largely. Like they may feel very basic emotions. It's said that psychopaths don't even feel fear, but, you know, maybe you know, maybe there is kind of a darkness in that type of existence that we can't really fully understand. And I'm not saying psychopaths don't have a right to exist. So I want to make it very clear. Psychopaths do have a right to exist just like we do. But what they do not have a right to do is to run the world on their terms. That's really all I'm saying. So yes, there will be a place for that kind of mindset for primary psychopaths, but they will be contained. So if they try to rule the world because they, in their own mind, they think that they can, you know, whatever they want, they can do it, they'll stop at nothing to achieve their goals, because they are essentially an intellect but without the heart. So it's like having a very powerful mind, like the mentation, and having the will, which is the will to act, but lacking the heart, lacking the emotional intelligence. So yeah, there'll be a place for them. That's one way I interpreted your question. Yeah. Exactly.
You said you know, you wouldn't want to get rid of the psychopaths. They have a right to exist. That sort of raises a question about what your perception is of the right to take a life. I mean, we don't have the death penalty in the UK. I know some states have it in the US. It often polls quite high on opinion polls in the UK, doesn't it? I think it's often very close, like 50-50. People want to bring back the death penalty. I'm dead set against it. I don't think the state should have the right to take someone's life. Under natural law, is it ever justified to take another life, human life?
Yes, it is. And I'll give an example that will be easy to understand. Because I think, like in anything, there are probably some gray areas where the answer may not be so readily obvious just in a quick analysis, but there are also many examples where it will be. So let's start with the ones where it is, where most people, I think, are still not recognizing this, even though it's easy to understand. So if you are walking down the street, actually, let me back up for a second. Let me give the principle first, and then we'll break it down. So when I use the term objective morality, really we're talking about three things, okay? The first aspect of objective morality is you have the ability for self-awareness and self-reflection. You can reflect on your own behavior. You're self-responsible. You're sovereign. You're in charge of yourself and your actions at all times, regardless of what they are. The second is don't harm others. Don't steal things that don't belong to you. Don't do things with other people's property without their consent, right? That's the second aspect. And then the third, of course, is for that to work is we need to be able to defend ourselves. So the third is the self-defense principle, which is if someone or something in creation tries to harm you, you have every right, and in fact, I would say you have a moral obligation to defend yourself through any means necessary from that violence, from that harm. So I'm going to talk about that third one in this example. So let's say you're walking down a street, it could be any street, and for whatever reason, a common thug, thief, a mugger, whatever you want to call them, a criminal comes along, or anyone comes along and very clearly approaches you to cause you harm. It's very obvious. Maybe they're brandishing a weapon. Maybe they are speaking menacingly, whatever. Maybe they're raising their hand, raising a knife. But it's very obvious that they're about to commit an act of violence, right? They're about to break that second rule of morality. When that happens, the minute that happens, violence has already been committed, right? Even the threat to assault, where you don't know what's going to happen, is already violence, because if it plays out, they're going to harm you, right? So in that scenario, you have every right to defend yourself. It doesn't mean that you have to automatically do whatever you can to take their life. But if in the course of defending yourself, because they are using excessive force, you have no choice but to use an equal or greater amount of force in order to defend yourself, if through the course of that interaction you killed them, then your act of killing them was not murder. It was not an act of violence. it was not wrong. You were justified. Not justified. You were right. You were correct in doing that in that case, because you had every right to defend yourself, right? Your life was going to be taken from you, potentially, or your body was going to be assaulted, your property was going to be stolen. Now, if you can defend yourself without killing the other person, that's great. That's great. But if you happen to kill them because you're defending yourself from being assaulted, you did not commit a wrong, and you have every right to do that. And no being come along and claim that you did anything wrong. So that's a very cut and dry scenario where taking a life is right because it's done in self-defense. You did not start. You didn't start it. You were walking down the street, minding your own business. If nothing had happened, there's a streetwise saying, "Don't start nothing, there won't be nothing." Right? You don't. If no one starts anything with you, then yeah. I mean, violence was initiated against you in that scenario, and once violence started, there are no rules. That's why they say there are no rules in war. All bets are off. There are no rules. It's whatever you have to do to defend yourself. Right now, we can be reasonable, and like I said, we don't have to target a nuclear bomb at someone who's trying to mug us on the street. You know what I'm talking about, like something out of proportion. But if you happen to kill that person, certainly if they were trying to kill you, to murder you because they were initiating, then you had every right to kill them. So that's a very cut and dry case. And I mentioned that scenario because even that very simple, easy to understand example is one that most people are failing on to understand and implement. So we, even to much less to go beyond that to talk about cases where, do we have a right to snuff out the life of someone who has already committed wrongs? And that's a little more complicated. But ultimately, I would say if there's someone out there who has already killed many people and is showing no sign of ever stopping, then yes, we have a moral duty to put a stop to that. If that means, ending their life, then so be it, right? Wow. And that is not murder.
You're doing it for the benefit. Sounds horrible putting it that way, but you're doing it for the community at large. For protection of the community. Would you say?
Well, you're doing it for self-defense. Again, we always have to put it through the filter of why. The why behind taking a life or any kind of force always has to be because of self-defense. And again, we also can defend our children and our communities who may not be able to stand up and defend themselves directly because of their situation.
Right. That's one of those interesting grey areas. There's the grey areas that interest me, but it's someone who's committed 10 murders, a serial killer. This is where I struggle a bit. That whether it's justified to take their life before they commit another crime. I don't know. I'm not sure how
Not necessarily. Not necessarily, because what if they truly, what if we, through some process, and I'm not saying it would be a court, that's the way we think of it, but maybe through some process we came to know and understand that this person recognizes what they did was wrong, and they have committed to never acting that way again, and maybe they've done some other thing or agreed to do something else in restitution, in other words, to pay their debt to society, that we've agreed upon. Then in that case, I don't see any reason why we would take their life, because then they would not have a chance to learn from their mistake, right? They've already agreed to never do that again, right? So to just take their life just because they killed 10 people, but are not showing any sign that they're going to do that again, that just becomes vengeance now. That becomes vengeance. That's not true justice in the divine sense. That's, I'm angry because that happened. I'm going to take out that. I'm going to exact, retribution on that person. But that's different than the scenario that someone who has made it clear that they will continue to kill and maybe are, continue to kill over time and have no intention of stopping. And that's just, clear that that's the case. They have made no sign of repentance. They have no sign of admitting that they've done anything wrong. They may even claim that they are doing the right thing. So that's a very different scenario.
Yeah, they should have a job in the government, probably, by the sounds of it. That's one of their number one.
Some of them probably do.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they do. We love war. It's good. It's good for business.
Yeah, exactly.
It's good for the FTSE 100. Sorry, the Dow Jones, whatever it is over there. David, we're rocked up to an hour already, and we haven't talked about your work and your website and everything. I mean, the links, it's up on the screen, and the links are in the show notes. But, I mean, before we wrap up, do you want to tell us a bit about where people can find you and what you're doing with your website and content creation and whatnot?
Yeah, that'd be great. And just before I do that, I want to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we could have gone on for ages.
Great.
I mean, you know, tax is another issue I wanted to get onto because, again, I mean, I've said it before, but our government has this great trick where when you become an employee, they take your tax out of your wages before you even see it. And when you become self-employed like me, and once a year you have to write a big fat check and hand that over to these fools who run the country, it really changes your perspective. But so yeah, next time we'll talk about tax. But go on, tell us about your website.
Sure. So everything that I do, all this work that I do to share this important knowledge, I created my own platform that I call it freedom5.art. I created it about a year and a half ago. That's the website, freedom5.art. I chose the .art domain synchronistically because I am in the process of becoming more of an artist myself. And I think that when we create media, when we share these important ideas, we're also, in addition to being teachers, we're also artists. And actually, I wrote and published 6 songs so far as part of my Music for Freedom. You'll find those also on the website. So you can find all of my work and also work of others. You can find the services I offer, some of the tools that I provide, like the 7-day mental freedom challenge for people who want to take some of these lessons and try to start incorporating in their own lives. So everything I do, you'll find there. And of course, I'm also on pretty much every social media platform: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. I use all the well-known and less well-known platforms, so you can find it there as well.
Excellent. Sounds good. Well, the links are in the show notes. And there's a lot of YouTubers, podcasters, content creators who listen to this. And it's particularly relevant to you, I would feel, you know, when it comes to things like making videos and web design, graphic design, all those jobs that I hate doing when I just want to be on the mic. But, you know, David might be able to help you. Hit him up. Check the link out in the show notes. Okay, David, we'll sign off now. Just stay on the line for us for 1 minute while we play ourselves out. And the rest of you out in YouTube land, we'll be back in 10 minutes for part 2.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh, hell's bells. Right, okay. Right, take care. Sayonara. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.